Hey, this is Lisa, and we are moving into session 4. Our basis today will be the chapter In the Day to Day. That is the last chapter in part 1 of the You Are Loved book. Beginning next week, things will look a little more different. It's going to be more topical. It's just like they're standalone chapters where it's just a topic that we'll go through, we'll cover, and have a takeaway. But as we finish up part 1, I just want to reinforce that everything in part 1 has to do with building the foundation of you understanding the importance of knowing God's love for you in an experiential way, not just something that you've heard about or that you know in your head, but something that you're experiencing in your day-to-day life. So the kickoff verse or the anchor verse for this chapter is, "As the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love." That's John 15:9. I wasn't really going to use that verse today as my focal point, but just as an interesting note, I did see when I opened up to John 14 that next to this verse, it is a note that I've made for myself from a sermon back in February. And the pastor used the word abide and gave this imagery that I thought was really expressive. And for simple people like me, it helped me kind of get a good visual of what abiding might look like. He said, like a goldfish in a bowl, his existence and breath is in that bowl, meaning that everything, when you abide, everything of your existence abides in this thing. For the fish, it was the fish bowl. But for us, everything in us, our entire existence and our breath is in Jesus. So I thought that was just such cool imagery. But the verse that we're going to actually use that I've brought up here in the beginning of this chapter is John 14:23. We will hop back up real quick, and I'm just going to say verse 18 says, "I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you." These are red letter words. Jesus is saying it. He's telling his disciples that he's going to be leaving them, but what the role of the Spirit is. So then we move down to 23, where he says, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him." Abode means home or place of residence. So the last phrase is what I'm going to take off on this segment of this video, of this week's video. But before I do that, I want to clarify the words that it begins with. If anyone loves me, he will keep my word. So many people will take that to mean that the proof, like this is some kind of works-based thing. If you love me, you're going to keep my word. It doesn't mean that. It's meaning that if you do love me, you are going to naturally keep my word. You're going to naturally do what I say. That's what we do when we love someone and we know they love us. We naturally obey. So please don't turn this around and try to make this, well, look, I'm just not measuring up because there are things I'm not doing right. So obviously that God's not going to come and love me and move in with me. That's not what this is saying. So this has to do with continual relationship, that when you are walking in a love relationship with him, you will begin to naturally obey. You will begin to naturally do the will of the Father. That's taken me years and years. I can tell you that early Lisa was anything but obedient, not necessarily just because I was willfully disobedient, but there were so many chaotic things in my own life that I wasn't walking in obedience because I wasn't really walking in love either. So I hope that makes sense. I wanted to clarify before we get to the actual phrase that I want to focus on today. And we will come to him and make our home with him. So I want you to think about this, that Jesus and the Father, they have come to make their home within you. We are called the temple of God. The body is now, we are the temple. The believer is the temple of God, that he resides in us. So now we know that in the day-to-day life, you have Jesus and you have the Father living at home with you. So I want to say that can you imagine living in a home with people that you didn't communicate with? I mean, how miserable actually some of us have or do live in homes where you're not communicating. It's miserable. That's not what you're intended to do in your relationship with God the Father or Jesus. So we want to focus on what it's like. What does it look like in the day-to-day to actually experience life? And in this session, even though I kind of brought it up in the last chapter a little bit more about a relationship with God the Father. I didn't really touch on that in last week's video. I wanted to save that for this week's video and kind of make God the Father the more of the focus of this particular part. We're going to do this video in three parts, and this part 1 has more to do with God the Father in the home. So I've made a comment here on one of the book pages that says some settle for weekend visitations with God. I want you to think about that. There are some people that in their existence with God the Father, even though God is in the home with them, God is in your home with you, He resides with you, that you settle for weekend visitation. You go on Sunday and get a little bit of sermon. You get somebody pours a little something into you, and that is your only experience with God the Father, is what someone else is telling you, and you're just visiting on the weekends. Well, for some people, this, as I wrote the beginning of this chapter, it came to mind that 50% of marriages end in divorce. So many of us, including myself, we lived in a home without a father. And so now I did end up with a wonderful stepdad. Thank goodness for that. But my early years, I didn't have a dad in the home. And so for some of us, weekend visitation is a totally comfortable feeling. We don't feel like we need more from God the Father because we're just used to not having a father to father us during our day-to-day walk, if that makes sense. So even if you had a dad in the home, yours might have been a distant dad, a neglectful dad, a hurtful dad. So many people experience what I did in my early. So as with technology, I'm having some glitches here, so I might have to piece this together. I can see some lag times and some freezing, so we're just going to go with this and do the best we can. So where I was leaving off is that some of us are used to not having a father to father us, and we're perfectly comfortable with that. So we don't make it a priority to move into God as Father and allow ourselves to be that child, to be the kid that runs to Him in every situation. And it crosses my mind, and I've spoken on this before, but even for the girls who have this great dad, it can be very complicated for you to move into a very intimate relationship with God as Father because you've got your needs met with your earthly dad. So isn't it something that whether you've had a distant relationship with your dad or a great relationship with your dad, that either relationship can make it a little more difficult for you to relate to God as Father because you either don't want to relate to Him as Father or you don't need to relate to Him as a Father. So I'm going to have to challenge you this week that you really are going to have to look at your relationship with God as Father and pose the questions to yourself. You may have done that some last week. It's with the questions at the end of the book, but you're going to have to continue to pursue this. This took me years to overcome. I mean, when He first showed me that I was much more relational with my relationship with Jesus than I was with Him, with God as Father. I understood it, I saw it, I knew why, but it wasn't fixed for a really long time. So I don't know if that resonates with any of you, but you really are going to have to work toward that intimate relationship with God as Father. The dad's role is so vital in your life that it's lacking. The father's role is lacking in many physical homes, but it's not lacking in your spiritual home, because we're told, Jesus Himself says that I and the Father will come and make our home with you. So you do have a dad in the home. If you have lived the life of an absentee father, then that is no more. You have a father in the home. If you have this wonderful father that you go running to for everything, you're going to have to get over that. That's a hindrance in a way, because you've got to begin to come to your Heavenly Father and meet with Him in your day-to-day life. Or if you have a father who was in your home but just constantly distracted and he worked so much and you felt like you weren't as important to him, you have a father in the home who is attentive and caring and loving and compassionate. So you've got to work on your relationship with getting to be a daddy's girl. I'm going to share this. I hadn't really planned on it, but I'm going to pop this in here. But I talk often about my little Zoe. She's in my lap. I want to pick her up and show her to you, but if I get her started, then she's going to run up and down. But she's deaf and she's blind. I think I've shared that with you. Well, it's gotten worse. This past weekend, I think she's completely gone blind. We were even outside in the sun, and she was running into furniture and running into a little wall, and so she has become so dependent. You think about being 3.5 pounds, you live in complete darkness, and you live in silence. How scary that must be. I'm her person. She wants to be with me at all times, and she can't find me at times. She loses me, and even though I'm just a foot away and I'm trying to get her attention, I'm waving my hands or I'm saying her name, she can't hear me and she can't see me. So even though I'm right here waiting for her, waiting to pick her up and waiting to help her, she goes the other direction. And I've noticed I have to be careful, because when I go try to find her, if I come up behind her and touch her, it scares her to death. She jumps because somebody's touched her and she's already scared. So do you realize in so many ways, so many women are living just like that? They're living in what they feel is blindness or deafness, or they're not hearing from God. They're not seeing God. So to them, they feel like they're living in the darkness, or they're living in silence. Well, God is right there. He is in your home saying, I'm right here. I'm trying to chase you down. I'm trying to get my hands around you and lift you up to me. So you are going to have to be willing to slow down and maybe be a little more still, because when you're off looking around for him, and sometimes when we're looking for him, we're feeling those needs with other things, but rather than taking off and looking for a God that feels like he's far away, just be still. Be still and know that he is God, and let him wrap his arms around you. Let him show you that he is there for you in these seasons of darkness and of silence. Because right now I know a lot of people are feeling super, not just isolated, but they're feeling far from love, far from friends, far from the fellowship that we normally have with other believers. And so some people are not going to church. This may be your only way each week, besides online sermons that I hope you're listening to, but this is your only way to meet with friends. I hope you're using this study to do that. But anyway, learn to be still, learn to be with him in the day-to-day. You'll often hear me use the phrase grow up and grow out. That's what I know we as believers need to do. We need to grow up in our faith, and we need to grow out and reach others. Really, until we grow up, we're very ineffective at growing out and reaching others. I know me personally, and I'm saying this, I've seen others do the same thing, but me personally, as a babe in my faith, I said and did a lot of things that I look back on now just completely red-faced, because I really, in my passion and in my zeal, I would say things that were inaccurate. I would make a stand on something that I really didn't know a whole lot about. So I do look back, and I realize that I think I probably embarrassed the kingdom in a lot of ways by the immaturity of my faith. So we do have to grow up in our faith before we really effectively grow out. So to that point, I want to say that very often a lot of churches have the mentality of get them saved and put them to work. I've seen it so many times that rather than getting them saved and helping them grow up in that early infancy, they're just immediately told, hey, you go out and you do and you do and you do, and people buy into that. I'm not saying that that's exactly what happened with me, but I will say that I missed the biggest thing, which is God's love. And everything I ever stand on always goes back to the love God has for me and how transformational that has been in my life. And I'm telling you how transformational it will be in your life. So we've discussed in another segment about how you do have a father in the home. And I was saying how vital it is that your father is in the home, and that you do know that you've not been left an orphan, that in John 14, we were told that where Jesus said, I and the Father will come and make our home with you. So you know you have a father in your home, and this father wants to raise you up from infancy to become a more mature believer. So what I want to stand on, I'm calling this segment Milk of Your Faith. God's love is the milk of your faith. Whether you are a newborn believer or whether you are a believer who has walked with the Lord for 20, 30, 40 years, if you haven't settled the issue of his love for you, then you've not been nourished on the milk of your faith. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3:2, he says, I gave you milk to drink, not solid food, for you are not able to receive it. Indeed, even now you are not yet able. I think there are a lot of babes in the faith who are gumming on a big piece of steak, some huge doctrinal thing that they're trying to grapple with, yet they haven't even digested and been nourished by the milk of their faith. Again, I'm equating that to God's love for you. Something I've noticed in my own life, that through all of the ups and downs, through all of the times I've struggled most and I've failed the most, once, I would look at all these areas where I would miss the mark, or I would fall again and again. And I kept thinking I needed to clean up those areas or get rid of those sins in my life. I thought it was up to me to do those things. But what I did ultimately find out is once I embraced this love he has for me, that so many of those things went away on their own. There was no work on my part required. I've explained how we're going into part 2 in another chapter of the You Are Loved book, and how that entire section is day-to-day. Is topical chapters that talk about when you know you're loved, you can and will live your life this way. And there's different headers. The truth is, when you know you're loved, you do live differently. You live out your life in a way that when you're standing on the foundation of love, you live out your life in a way that you can live it out with trust and with surrender in a way you can't do when you're not experiencing or feel, I'll use the word feel, where you're not feeling his love for you because you don't trust him to step out. How can you be obedient to a God you don't trust? How can you surrender to a God you don't trust? But when you settle the love issue, and then trust comes and surrender comes, obedience comes with it. I said when we talked in an earlier segment, I had mentioned about that verse where it talks about that if you love me, you will obey. This isn't dependent. It's not like, okay, the proof of your love is your obedience. That's not it. It's that when you love, you are naturally obedient. So all that to say that the milk of your faith is this love. You've got to grow up in that before you become the teenager out in your faith, before you become the mature adult out in your faith. Also, 1 Peter 2:20 says, it equates the word to milk. It says, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. Growing up in your faith. So God's love is the milk. God's word is the milk. These are the things that nourish and grow you. Yet these are the relationships that are most neglected. Our relationship with God the Father, in walking in times of prayer, in a quiet time, our relationship with the Word, which we know Jesus is the Word, our relationship with the Word, that is all the pure milk that will grow us up. Originally, I had intended for us to turn to Luke 18:17. And let me go over here. This is where Jesus says, truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child will not enter it at all. There's something so beautiful about the idea of us being children and God drawing us to himself, that there's something about that childlike faith that is so beautiful that we can embrace this milk of our faith. So as we go into part 3 of this particular chapter, of the day-to-day chapter, we're going to talk about what you do with your time and how you allot your time, and how often people will say, well, I'm too busy to spend time with God. Well, you can't neglect the nourishment. You wouldn't go without eating, breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. You would have something to sustain you. You absolutely must nourish yourself with this milk of your faith that I'm calling God's love and God's word. You absolutely must. But so to come back to our part 1 of this, I want to remind you that you do have a loving Father in the home with you, and he is in pursuit of you to help grow you up and nurture you and raise you into the person he's always deemed that you would be. And who you are right now, even if you're stumbling, that is okay, because this love will end up catching you and helping you stand back up. So I hope this has been an encouraging word for you today. And for those of you who are taking the journey on the gathering videos, you'll go next into part 3, and I'll be right there with you. Thanks. So as we finalize my contribution to what you're going to do for the in the day-to-day chapter, I'm just trying to pick up some highlights and give you some different little thoughts. But in this this little section here, I'm going to totally get in your business, because I'm going to talk about the time that you allot and set aside in your relationship with God. There's a phrase here, and I'll also put it up here as a caption. The time you spend in pursuit of the beloved is in direct relation to your closeness to Him. I cannot tell you how many people, women I've heard over the years say, well, I just don't really feel close to Him. I don't feel like I can really know Him. It's because people refuse to invest in the relationship. They absolutely refuse to invest their time. They give me every reason in the world why they tell me all these things they've got to do, and I will challenge that, because all of us have busy seasons. All of us have busy lives. All of us have gone through, through seasons where we just feel like that time is such a premium. But there's a phrase that I have in here in the book, or a quote that says that if you're saying that you don't have time to spend with God, then there is something on your plate that He didn't put there. Because what loving father would give you such a busy schedule that He could never spend time with you, that you would never have time for Him? So those parents who have these busy ball schedules and do all of this, do you fill your child's schedule with so many things, then they're so busy that they can't even sit down to dinner with you? Of course you want to have time with your child just like He does. So many things on your plate of busyness likely are not coming from Him. They're your choice. They're your commitments. So I guess I'm being pretty in your face, but that is the fact. And I think if you reason through this, you'll see the same thing. And also, maybe you're underestimating. What if 15 minutes? You're underestimating how much time. You don't have to be the big holy roller who's spending 2 or 3 hours in the Word and in prayer. What if you give 15 minutes in reading time? And even if it's things that you're reading that you think to yourself, well, I'm really not getting anything out of this. I hear that often. But I'll tell you what happens is seeds can be planted in that small amount of time that God will water and use when the time is right, when the harvest is due. Because I think verses I've read years ago that I didn't, in my mind, I would have told you, well, I'm not really getting anything out of this. The seed was planted, God watered it over time, and when I needed that exact word, that exact piece of wisdom that popped to mind, even if it wasn't the exact quote, the essence of the verse would pop to mind that God would use to answer questions that I might have. So, as I said, I will get in your business in this chapter, where I'm going to ask you to honestly reflect on how much time do you spend on Facebook and Instagram, on Twitter or Pinterest. Pinning. Oh my goodness, people are on there for hours pinning. And then you're saying you don't have time for God. So TV time, hobbies, reading, whatever. I'm going to ask you to take an honest inventory of your time, and then go back at the end of the chapter and ask yourself, okay, now, is all of this necessary? Do I have time that I can devote to spend time with God in prayer and in quiet time and in the Word? So I think that concludes this week's, and then next week I'm excited to move into part 2, because I think there's some good topics that are going to be relevant for all of us. And I will see you back next week. I will have an assignment. There are questions only at the end of this, so I might do just a few supplemental activities, not much, because I think there's plenty of questions that I cover here. So anyway, God bless you. Hope you have a good week, and I can't wait to see you back next week for session 5. Thanks.